April 1945. Western Germany. The front had moved east, but the sound of war still lingered in the distance. A low, uneven thunder rolling beyond the tree line. Inside a temporary U.S. run holding camp on the edge of a bomb-damaged town, the air was still. Rows of canvas tents stood in ordered lines across a muddy yard. Barbed wire marked the perimeter. Watchtowers overlooked the field with quiet vigilance. Groups of German women sat or stood in small clusters near the barracks. Some had worn auxiliary uniforms only weeks before. Others were civilians gathered in the chaos of retreat and surrender. Their world had narrowed to routines, roll calls, ration lines, waiting. Most spoke little. Many simply watched. Near the far end of the yard, several American soldiers carried wooden cases from a transport truck. They worked without ceremony, setting the cases down on a patch of cleared ground. Latches opened. Brass caught the pale afternoon light. A drum was assembled. A trumpet lifted. A portable phonograph was placed beside them. For a moment, nothing moved. Then the first notes of music rose into the cold spring air. The scene had become possible only because the war in Europe had reached its final, collapsing phase, and that long road to this quiet yard began months earlier, far beyond Germany's western borders. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe had entered its final phase, but the conditions that produced scenes inside Allied run camps had taken shape much earlier. The decisive shift began in the summer of 1944. On June 6th, Allied forces landed in Normandy. The invasion opened a western front that Germany could not fully contain. Over the following weeks, U.S., British, and Canadian armies expanded the beachhead and pushed inland through hedgerows, towns, and defensive lines that had been fortified for years. By August 1944, Paris was liberated. German forces retreated toward the east, abandoning positions across France and Belgium. The speed of the Allied advance created new logistical challenges. Large numbers of German soldiers surrendered or were captured in encirclements and retreats. Civilians fled combat zones in columns that moved along roads already crowded with military traffic. Rail networks were damaged or destroyed. Administrative systems inside Germany's western territories began to fracture. The Allied armies did not simply advance, they occupied. Each mile gained brought new populations under their control. Prisoners of war, forced laborers, displaced civilians, and local residents caught between collapsing authority and advancing troops. Temporary holding areas and camps became necessary. Some were set up in open fields, others in requisitioned barracks or former military installations. The U.S. Army, following established procedures and obligations under the Geneva Convention, organized systems to register, guard, and supply those in custody. The winter of 1944 to 1945 slowed the advance. The German counteroffensive in the Ardennes, launched in December 1944, briefly reversed the momentum. Snow, fuel shortages, and heavy casualties marked the final large-scale German attempt to regain initiative in the West. When the offensive failed, German military capacity in the region declined rapidly. By early 1945, Allied forces crossed the Rhine at multiple points. Bridges were captured or built under fire. Once across, the advance into western Germany accelerated. Cities such as Cologne, Bonn, and Frankfurt fell in succession. Industrial areas were secured. German military units surrendered in increasing numbers, often in disorganized groups. Alongside them were auxiliaries, including women who had served in communications, administration, or support roles, and civilians displaced by bombing or retreat. The distinction between prisoner, refugee, and internee sometimes blurred in the immediate aftermath of capture. All required processing, housing, and supervision. American units entering German territory encountered a landscape shaped by years of total war. Urban centers were heavily damaged. Transportation systems were disrupted. Food distribution had become unreliable in many areas. The U.S. Army's logistical structure, built for sustained operations across continents, now had to support not only combat forces, but also growing populations under occupation. Supply depots, field kitchens, medical stations, and temporary camps expanded behind the front lines. Military regulations emphasized discipline and order. Prisoners of war were to be treated according to international conventions. Civilians were to be screened and directed to appropriate authorities. Camps varied in size and permanence. Some existed only for days as units moved forward. Others became semi-permanent installations as the front stabilized or passed beyond them. Guard units, administrative personnel, and support staff managed daily routines inside these controlled environments. At the same time, American soldiers carried with them aspects of their own military culture. Many units included train bands or musicians. Portable phonographs, radios, and instruments were common in rear areas. Music served practical purposes, maintaining morale, marking ceremonies, and providing structured recreation during long deployments. In forward zones, such activities were limited by operational demands. But as front lines shifted and combat moved farther east, moments of relative stillness appeared in places that had been battlefields only weeks before. By March and April 1945, large portions of Western Germany were under Allied control. Organized resistance continued in some regions, but the overall direction of the war was clear. The Third Reich's administrative structure was breaking apart. Civilian authority had weakened. Millions were on the move across Central Europe. In this environment, camps and holding areas became points of temporary stability, places where surrender, captivity, and occupation intersected under military supervision. Within those spaces, daily life followed strict routines. Roll calls, food distribution, medical checks, and administrative processing filled the hours. Guards enforced regulations. Prisoners and internees adjusted to uncertainty about their future. The atmosphere was often quiet but tense. Yet as combat operations moved farther away, small changes in routine began to occur. Supplies stabilized. Administrative systems became more organized. Soldiers found brief periods between duties. These conditions set the stage for encounters that would have been impossible during active fighting. As the war approached its end in Europe, the environment inside some camps shifted from immediate crisis to controlled waiting. It was in that transitional period between frontline combat and formal surrender that unexpected sounds sometimes carried across the yards of temporary enclosures. By the final months of the war in Europe, the Allied advance had produced a network of camps across newly occupied German territory. Some are prisoner of war enclosures holding captured Wehrmacht personnel. Others were temporary internment areas for auxiliaries, local officials, or civilians awaiting screening. Still others became early displaced person centers as forced laborers and refugees moved through the same regions. The U.S. Army organized these spaces quickly, often using open fields, requisition barracks, or former German military facilities. Inside these camps, order and routine were essential. Barbed wire defined perimeters. Guard towers and patrols maintained security. Administrative staff recorded names, ranks, and units where applicable. Medical teams conducted examinations. Field kitchens prepared rations designed to meet minimum nutritional standards while preserving military supply chains for combat units. The aim was stability. Processing large numbers of people required predictability and discipline. Among those held in Allied custody were German women. Some had served as auxiliaries in communications, clerical work, or air defense support. Others were nurses attached to military hospitals. Many were civilians caught in the collapse of administrative structures as towns changed hands. Their experiences varied widely. Some had been evacuated westward ahead of the front. Others were detained during security sweeps in recently captured areas. All found themselves in environments governed by Allied regulations and guarded by foreign soldiers. The U.S. Army operated under established legal frameworks. The Geneva Convention outlined standards for the treatment of prisoners of war. Although not all detainees fit neatly into that category, military authorities applied similar organizational methods across different groups. Housing was basic but structured. Sanitation, medical care, and food distribution followed set schedules. Inspections ensured compliance with regulations. Communication with the outside world was limited, but, in some cases, possible through approved channels such as the International Red Cross. Daily life inside a camp moved slowly. Mornings often began with roll call. Groups assembled in designated areas while guards checked numbers and records. Afterward came meals, usually simple and repetitive: bread, soup, and occasionally preserved meat or vegetables depending on supply. Medical stations treated illness, exhaustion, and minor injuries. Administrative officers conducted interviews or processed paperwork. Afternoons passed in waiting. Evenings brought another roll call, then curfew. For the detainees, uncertainty defined the atmosphere. Many did not know where they would be sent next. Some expected release once identities were verified. Others anticipated longer internment. News traveled unevenly. Rumors spread easily. The sound of distant artillery, though fading, reminded everyone that the war had not yet formally ended. Within this environment, emotional responses ranged from relief at surviving to anxiety about the future. American soldiers assigned to guard or administer these camps faced their own adjustments. Many had spent months in continuous combat operations. The shift to occupation duties required a different kind of discipline. Instead of advancing under fire, they now enforced regulations, distributed supplies, and managed interactions with former enemy personnel and civilians. Training emphasized professionalism. Orders stressed adherence to international law and the importance of maintaining order during a volatile transition period. Despite strict routines, elements of American military culture accompanied the soldiers. Music was one of the most persistent. U.S. Army units often included train bands used for ceremonies, parades, and morale. Even when full bands were not present, individual soldiers carried harmonicas, guitars, or small instruments. Portable phonographs and records traveled in supply trucks. Radio broadcasts reached rear areas when signal conditions allowed. Music provided familiarity in unfamiliar landscapes. It marked time, lifted morale, and offered brief respite from the strain of prolonged deployment. In forward combat zones, opportunities for organized music were limited, but as front lines moved eastward and certain areas stabilized, soldiers sometimes found short intervals between duties. During these periods, informal performances occurred in encampments, motor pools, or administrative areas. Such moments were not staged for audiences beyond the units themselves. They were simply part of maintaining cohesion and morale within the ranks. Inside camps holding German detainees, strict boundaries remained in place. Guards and detainees were separated by regulation. Interaction was controlled, yet sound carried across space regardless of fences or procedures. When soldiers played instruments or used phonographs within designated areas, the music did not remain confined. It drifted across open yards, over tents and barracks, and into spaces where those in custody waited out the uncertain final weeks of the war. By April 1945, as Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany and the collapse of organized resistance accelerated, some camps entered a transitional phase. The immediate urgency of mass surrender gave way to administrative management. Supplies stabilized. Processing systems became more regular. The tempo of daily life remained controlled, but less chaotic than during the first days of capture. Within this environment, even small deviations from routine stood out. A few notes from a trumpet, the rhythm of a snare drum, the faint crackle of a record player. In a setting defined by order and silence, such sounds were unexpected. Yet they were not extraordinary within the broader context of the U.S. Army's presence. They were simply part of the culture soldiers carried with them, a reminder that beyond the wire, the war was nearing its end. From this environment of routine, regulation, and quiet tension emerged a series of human perspectives that reveal how such moments were experienced from multiple sides. By early 1945, many German women held in Allied custody had lived through years of escalating war. Some had served in auxiliary roles attached to military units: clerks, communication staff, medical assistants, anti-aircraft helpers. Others were civilians who had followed evacuation routes westward or remained in towns overtaken by advancing armies. Their arrival in Allied camps did not occur all at once. It came in waves, shaped by the speed of the Allied advance and the collapse of German administrative control. Inside the camps, routines replaced movement. For weeks or months, their lives have been defined by evacuation trains, air raids, and shifting front lines. Now, suddenly, they were stationary. The noise of combat still echoed in the distance, but their immediate surroundings were controlled and quiet. This shift created a complex emotional atmosphere. Relief at surviving the fighting coexisted with uncertainty about what came next. Many did not know whether they would be released, transferred, or held for longer screening. Daily routines were repetitive but stabilizing. Roll calls established structure. Meal distribution provided predictability. Medical checks addressed immediate physical needs. The presence of guards, though a reminder of captivity, also signaled order in a landscape where authority had recently collapsed. For many detainees, the most striking change was the absence of sudden movement. No sirens, no forced marches, no hurried evacuations. Waiting replaced urgency. Within this environment, sensory perception sharpened. Small changes became noticeable. The sound of vehicles arriving. The distribution of new supplies. A shift in weather. Any deviation from routine carried weight. Silence, punctuated only by administrative commands or distant artillery, became the dominant backdrop of daily life. In such conditions, unexpected sound stood out with unusual clarity. Angle 2. American soldiers in transition. For the American soldiers assigned to these camps, the war had entered a different phase. Many had crossed France and Belgium in rapid advances, endured winter fighting, and participated in the push across the Rhine. Their roles now shifted from direct combat to occupation and administration. Guard duty, supply distribution, and processing of detainees required patience and discipline rather than immediate tactical action. Military training emphasized professionalism in these assignments. Regulations governed conduct toward prisoners and civilians. Orders stressed adherence to international conventions. The goal was to maintain order while preparing for the broader responsibilities of occupation. Soldiers rotated through shifts in watchtowers, perimeter patrols, and administrative support. Between duties, they waited, sometimes for long stretches, in camps that were no longer under direct threat, but still operated under strict control. In this transitional period, soldiers sought familiar routines to maintain morale. Letters from home, maintenance of equipment, and small forms of recreation filled available time. Music was one of the most accessible forms of recreation. Many units included trained musicians who had performed in military bands before or during the war. Even in units without formal bands, individual soldiers carried harmonicas, guitars, or small brass instruments. Portable phonographs and records were common in supply trucks, especially in rear areas. Music served several purposes. It marked ceremonies, provided structured leisure, and reinforced a sense of normalcy. During long deployments, such moments were brief but valued. When combat operations moved farther away and administrative duties dominated the day, opportunities to play music increased slightly. These performances were usually informal. A few soldiers gathering near a truck or tent, assembling instruments, and playing familiar tunes. The intended audience was often just fellow soldiers. Yet the physical layout of camps meant that sound did not remain contained. Open yards, canvas tents, and minimal structures allowed music to carry across space. What began as a small morale activity for a handful of soldiers could be heard by many others nearby, including those inside the wire. Angle 3. Administration and controlled environments. Camp administrators balanced strict regulation with practical realities. Maintaining order among large groups required consistency. Guard rotations, roll calls, and scheduled distributions formed the backbone of daily operations. Any activity within the camp perimeter had to align with regulations. Recreation for guards was permitted within designated areas and times, provided it did not interfere with duties or security. Music, when present, fell within this framework. Military bands sometimes performed for ceremonies or official events. Informal playing occurred during off-duty hours. There was no formal program designed to present music to detainees. Interaction across the wire remained limited and controlled. However, the environment itself allowed for indirect contact through shared soundscapes. The presence of music in or near camps did not signal a relaxation of discipline. Guards remained on post. Regulations were enforced. Administrative tasks continued. But the sound of instruments introduced a different atmosphere, if only briefly. In a setting defined by order and quiet tension, even a short melody altered the sensory environment. These overlapping perspectives, detainees adjusting to captivity, soldiers transitioning from combat to occupation, and administrators maintaining structured routines, created conditions in which small, unexpected moments took on greater significance. Among them were instances when music, played without ceremony or announcement, drifted across camp yards and entered spaces where silence had become the norm. Angle 4. Music as structure and psychological stability. Throughout the Second World War, the U.S. military placed significant emphasis on morale. Long deployments, separation from home, and sustained combat created psychological strain across all theaters. Music served as one of the most reliable tools for maintaining emotional stability. Official military bands performed at ceremonies, troop movements, and public events in liberated cities. Informal music, played by individual soldiers, filled quieter moments between duties. In occupied Germany during early 1945, this practice continued, though on a smaller scale. Camps and administrative zones were not frontline environments in the same sense as active battlefields. As a result, soldiers sometimes had brief intervals in which structured recreation was permitted. Music provided familiarity. It reinforced identity in routine. A harmonica tune or a brass instrument exercise did not change the operational environment, but it offered a steady rhythm in a landscape that had been shaped by constant movement. From a psychological standpoint, such sounds also mark transition. Combat units moving into occupation roles had to adjust from rapid action to prolonged presence. Music bridged that shift. It connected soldiers to earlier routines from training camps or home bases. In this sense, when instruments appeared in camp yards, they represented continuity for the soldiers themselves, a reminder of order and structure in a foreign environment. For those inside the wire, the meaning was different. The same notes that signaled routine for one group could signal something unexpected for another. In camps where silence and regulation dominated daily life, any unfamiliar sound carried weight. Music, especially when it was melodic and sustained, stood apart from the clipped commands and mechanical noises that usually filled the air. Angle 5. Cultural contrast. The cultural environment of wartime Germany had changed significantly by 1945. Years of conflict had restricted public gatherings and limited civilian entertainment. Many urban centers had endured repeated bombing raids. Radio broadcasts were tightly controlled. Live performances became rare in heavily affected regions. By the final months of the war, normal cultural life had largely disappeared in many areas. American soldiers arrived with a different musical tradition. Swing, jazz, and popular standards have been central to U.S. military culture throughout the war. The Armed Forces Radio Service broadcast music across multiple theaters. Bands performed in staging areas, training camps, and rear bases. Even individual soldiers often carried records or sheet music. This contrast meant that when American music sounded in occupied German areas, it introduced a style and rhythm that had not been widely heard locally for some time. The difference was not simply one of nationality, but of wartime experience. German civilians and auxiliaries had spent years under conditions of restriction and bombardment. American troops, though hardened by combat, carried elements of home culture with them as part of a deliberate morale strategy. When these two worlds overlapped in controlled environments like camps, the contrast became audible. The music itself did not cross physical boundaries of regulation. Guards remained on one side. Detainees remained on the other. But sound did not recognize those boundaries. It moved across open ground, through canvas and wooden structures, and into shared airspace. In this way, music created a brief overlap of experience without altering the formal separation enforced by military rules. Angle 6. Historical documentation and observations. Archival records from the final months of the war and the early occupation period include references to music in and around Allied camps. Photographs show military bands performing for troops in newly secured towns. Reports from the American Red Cross and other observers describe organized recreation programs for soldiers stationed in rear areas. Memoirs from U.S. servicemen frequently mention carrying small instruments or playing records during periods of relative quiet. Direct documentation of specific moments when detainees heard such music is limited, but the broader context supports their occurrence. Camps were often located near administrative or logistical zones where soldiers lived and worked. Informal performances took place within earshot of those areas. Given the physical layout of many temporary camps, open fields with minimal structures, sound traveled easily. Military regulations did not prohibit soldiers from playing music during off-duty hours within authorized zones, nor did they create formal performances for detainees. The interaction, when it occurred, was indirect. Music functioned primarily as a morale activity for the troops. Yet its presence altered the atmosphere of the environment as a whole. These documented practices help frame the central moment of this narrative. By April 1945, the war in Europe was approaching its conclusion. Camps had stabilized into structured environments of waiting and administration. Soldiers adjusted to new duties. Detainees adjusted to uncertain futures. In that setting, when instruments were assembled in a yard and music began to play, the sound carried across both sides of the wire. All of these factors, psychological transition, cultural contrast, and documented practice, converged in specific places at specific times. One such moment unfolded in a camp yard during the final weeks of the war in Western Germany, when routine briefly gave way to an unexpected change in atmosphere. By April 1945, the Western Front in Europe had moved decisively into Germany. Many temporary camps established behind advancing Allied units were no longer within immediate range of heavy fighting. Artillery could still be heard on certain days, and aircraft continued to pass overhead, but the sense of constant frontline urgency had eased. Inside several U.S.-run holding areas, the rhythm of daily life settled into a structured routine governed by regulation and repetition. In one such camp on the edge of a damaged industrial town in western Germany, a broad yard lay between rows of canvas tents and prefabricated barracks. Barbed wire marked the boundary. Guard towers stood at each corner. Inside the enclosure, groups of German women, some in auxiliary uniforms, others in civilian clothing, moved through the day's schedule. Morning roll call, ration distribution, waiting. The atmosphere was quiet but attentive. Most detainees watched the routines around them carefully, measuring each day by small, predictable events. Outside the perimeter, near a line of supply trucks and maintenance tents, a group of American soldiers prepared for an afternoon interval between duties. Several had been assigned to administrative or guard rotations for weeks. Their roles were no longer defined by advancing across open terrain, but by maintaining order in a fixed location. With equipment checked and schedules set for the next shift, a short period of off-duty time opened. From a wooden transport crate, one soldier lifted a brass instrument. A trumpet carried through months of movement across France and into Germany. Another assembled a small snare drum from a separate case. A third positioned a portable phonograph on a flat surface near the trucks. The activity was unremarkable to those involved. Instruments were occasionally brought out in similar circumstances, played quietly for fellow soldiers during brief moments of rest. There was no formal performance planned. No audience was expected beyond the men gathered nearby. The first notes were tentative. A scale, a few measured tones to check pitch and valves. The drum followed with a steady rhythm. Then a familiar melody emerged, one of the popular standards that circulated widely among U.S. troops during the war. The music was not loud. It did not carry the volume of a full military band. But in the stillness of the camp environment, even moderate sound traveled easily. Across the open yard and through the barbed wire boundary, the notes reached the interior of the enclosure. At first, they blended with the ambient noise of the afternoon. Distant vehicles, muted conversation, the low hum of generators. Then the melody became distinct. It rose above the routine sounds of the camp. Heads turned. Conversations paused. Those inside the wire listened. The reaction was not immediate or dramatic. There was no sudden movement toward the fence. Regulations remained in place. Guards maintained their positions. Detainees stayed within assigned areas. Yet the atmosphere shifted. In a setting where most sounds were functional, commands, footsteps, equipment, the presence of music introduced a different rhythm. For many of the women inside the enclosure, it had been months since they had heard live instruments played in a calm, controlled setting. The contrast with recent experiences of air raids, evacuation marches, and bombardment was stark. The soldiers continued playing for a short interval. The trumpet carried the melody. The drum maintained a steady tempo. A second instrument joined briefly, adding harmony. The portable phonograph remained unused, its records stacked nearby in case the players chose to stop. The moment remained informal, bounded by time and duty schedules. It was not announced or prolonged. It simply unfolded within the ordinary flow of an afternoon. As the tune ended, the instruments lowered. The soldiers exchanged brief remarks among themselves, then prepared to return to assigned tasks. Guards rotated posts. Administrative staff resumed processing paperwork. Inside the enclosure, detainees returned to their routines. Yet for a few minutes, the atmosphere of the camp had shifted from rigid silence to something more layered, a reminder that beyond the boundaries of regulation, the war itself was nearing its conclusion. The significance of the moment did not lie in any official change of policy or procedure. It lay in the intersection of two transitions: soldiers moving from combat to occupation duties, and detainees moving from war's end toward uncertain futures. In that narrow window between conflict and formal surrender, sound crossed a boundary that people could not. The result was brief, controlled, and entirely consistent with the environment of the time. Within camps and holding areas, daily routines continued largely unchanged. Roll calls were conducted on schedule. Rations were distributed. Medical stations treated the exhausted and injured. Guards maintained watch. Yet the distant sound of continuous combat began to fade in many Western regions. Instead of constant artillery, there were intervals of quiet punctuated by passing vehicles or aircraft moving toward the front. This change in the soundscape altered how those inside the camps experienced time. Days felt less dominated by immediate danger and more by anticipation. In that environment, the brief appearance of music carried a different weight. For the American soldiers, it marked a short interval between duties, a moment to re-establish familiar routines carried across the Atlantic and through months of campaigning. Military culture had long included music as a stabilizing force. Bands had performed for troops in training camps, on transport ships, and in liberated cities. Even in forward areas, soldiers often relied on small instruments to maintain morale. The act of playing in the yard outside the camp followed that same pattern. It was not staged for effect. It was simply an extension of daily life among troops adjusting to a new phase of the war. For those inside the enclosure, the reaction was more subdued but noticeable. Observers later described the atmosphere in many late war camps as one of guarded stillness. The war's outcome was becoming clear, but the personal consequences for each individual remained uncertain. Hearing music, especially music associated with the advancing forces, introduced an unfamiliar layer to that stillness. It did not alter regulations or change the structure of the day. It marked a shift in tone. Instead of only the mechanical sounds of a military environment, there was melody. This change occurred against the backdrop of rapid political and military developments. On April 25, 1945, American and Soviet forces met at the Elbe River, effectively dividing Germany into zones of operation. Berlin was encircled. Communications within the German command structure deteriorated. In the west, organized resistance declined sharply. Large numbers of German units surrendered. Camps holding prisoners and detainees became more stable as front lines moved farther away. Administrative tasks replaced emergency measures. By early May, negotiations for surrender were underway. On May 7, 1945, Germany signed the Instrument of Unconditional Surrender at Reims. The agreement took effect on May 8. Across Allied-controlled territory, hostilities ceased. Camps that had been established during the final months of combat now entered a new phase under formal occupation authority. Processing and repatriation began on a larger scale. Some detainees were released quickly. Others were transferred for further screening. The atmosphere shifted again, this time from wartime management to post-war administration. Looking back through reports, photographs, and memoirs, historians note that the final weeks of the war in Western Germany were marked by a mixture of tension and transition. Soldiers who had spent months in combat adapted to new roles as occupiers and administrators. Civilians and former auxiliaries adjusted to life under foreign military authority. In this context, small moments, a shared sound, a brief interruption of routine, acquired symbolic resonance. They did not determine policy or strategy, but they reflected the changing nature of the environment. The music played outside the camp yard did not last long. Duty schedules resumed. Guards returned to posts. Administrative routines continued. Yet the moment remained part of a larger pattern that emerged in the closing weeks of the war. The gradual replacement of constant combat noise with quieter, more ordinary sounds. Engines idling instead of artillery firing. Voices in conversation rather than shouted commands. And, occasionally, the measured notes of instruments carried across open ground. As the war in Europe formally ended, these environments transformed again. Camps that had been established in haste became centers for processing, repatriation, and, in some cases, long-term occupation administration. The brief intersection of music and captivity became one of many small markers of a larger turning point. The moment when active warfare gave way to the complex responsibilities of peace. The consequences of that transition would unfold in the weeks and months that followed, reshaping not only the fate of those inside the camps, but the entire structure of post-war Germany. With Germany's unconditional surrender on May 8, 1945, the landscape of Western Germany shifted from battlefield to occupation zone. Across the region, American forces took responsibility for administering large populations of former prisoners, auxiliaries, and displaced civilians. Camps that had been hastily erected during the final months of fighting now became semi-permanent centers for processing, accommodation, and administration. Structures once intended for temporary use were reinforced with additional tents, makeshift shelters, and essential services to support growing numbers of internees. The surrender did not eliminate uncertainty. German soldiers surrendered in mass formations, but civilians and auxiliaries, especially women, faced ambiguous status. Military authorities categorized detainees according to role, rank, and potential threat. Auxiliary personnel who had supported the German war effort were often placed under extended supervision. Civilians displaced by bombing campaigns or retreating armies were registered and screened before being relocated. Red Cross teams assisted in providing basic care, food, and medical attention, documenting conditions and maintaining correspondence channels where possible. Within this framework, small aspects of human life, moments previously incidental, gained significance. Music, already present in camps during the closing weeks of combat, became an informal tool for both soldiers and detainees. Military bands performed occasionally for troops, and informal playing continued to mark intervals of the day. Reports from American administrators indicate that melodies drifting across camp yards could momentarily alter the psychological environment, easing tension and providing brief respite. These occurrences were neither widespread nor uniform, but were documented sufficiently to suggest They were a recurring phenomenon in several rear area camps. For German women, such moments contrasted sharply with the austerity of wartime life. Many had spent years under curfews, rationing, and the constant threat of bombing or forced labor. The presence of music in the camp yard, faint as it may have been, represented a sensory and emotional departure for what had become the default of silence and strict order. Though interaction with American soldiers remained limited, the human element of shared sound subtly bridged the physical and regulatory divide between captives and captors. In practical terms, the end of combat allowed administrative routines to expand and stabilize. Food distribution improved, medical services became more consistent, and detainees were able to attend to basic personal needs with less urgency. Guard rotations were maintained, but the intensity of watchfulness decreased in zones distant from front lines. The combination of structured routine and occasional cultural cues, such as music, contributed to a more predictable environment, allowing both soldiers and detainees to adjust gradually to post-war realities. The transition from active conflict to occupation also brought broader strategic implications. American forces faced the dual responsibility of securing territory and supporting the humane treatment of those under their supervision. Camps served as initial centers for repatriation and screening before individuals were transferred to long-term facilities or returned to civilian life. Every administrative decision reinforced the authority of Allied command while demonstrating adherence to international norms, a foundation that would later influence the post-war reconstruction of Germany and broader policies regarding displaced populations. The experiences of detainees and soldiers alike reflected a microcosm of Europe in transition, a society moving from the intensity of war toward the complexities of occupation, regulation, and eventual reconstruction. Even seemingly minor events, such as the brief presence of music in a camp yard, became markers of this shift, subtle reminders that, while war shaped the environment, human behavior continued to assert itself in unexpected ways. As weeks turned into months after Germany's surrender, the function of camps evolved further. Temporary holding facilities became centers for processing displaced persons, internees, and returning civilians. American forces, along with Allied relief organizations, implemented structured programs for food, shelter, medical care, and repatriation. German women, who had once been auxiliary personnel, nurses, or civilians swept into captivity, were gradually reintegrated into post-war society or relocated to areas determined by occupation authorities. The small human experiences within the camps, moments of shared sound, brief attention from soldiers, or unexpected kindness, left lasting impressions. Music, in particular, became an informal marker of transition. For the American soldiers, it was a reminder of continuity, a thread of morale and culture carried from training camps to European battlefields. For German women, it was an auditory symbol of a world beyond strict routines, regulations, and the uncertainty of captivity. Though brief and indirect, the presence of music illustrated how cultural exchange could occur even across physical and hierarchical divides. Official reports from the period describe improved conditions in camps, better medical care, consistent rations, and the introduction of organized activities for internees. Red Cross documentation confirms that small cultural or recreational events were tolerated, provided they did not interfere with security or administration. Photographs and memoirs from both soldiers and former detainees capture moments in which music, games, or informal gatherings punctuated the monotony of camp life. While these accounts rarely emphasize dramatic interactions, they convey the subtle impact of humanizing elements in environments otherwise dominated by control and regulation. The long-term effects of these transitional moments extended beyond the immediate post-war period. Camps became initial sites where German civilians and former auxiliaries could experience the procedural fairness of the occupying forces. For many, the contrast with wartime discipline and authoritarian structures highlighted a shift in authority and expectation. The perception of humane treatment, even in small details such as tolerating music or allowing personal items, contributed to the broader acceptance of occupation policies and the eventual reintegration of populations into civilian life. At a larger level, the experiences inside these camps reflected broader patterns in post-war Europe. Occupying forces had to balance security with rehabilitation, discipline with humanity, and oversight with opportunity for personal agency. The success of these measures influenced post-war reconstruction policies, including approaches to displaced persons, repatriation, and reconciliation in occupied regions. The quiet, human-centered moments, like the simple act of playing music across a camp yard, were emblematic of this dual approach, combining practical administration with recognition of shared humanity. In retrospect, these events underscore how small, controlled interventions could resonate emotionally and psychologically in environments shaped by conflict. The war's end did not immediately erase fear, uncertainty, or trauma, but structured interactions, combined with elements of ordinary human life, began to restore a sense of rhythm, normality, and connection. The music that drifted across camp yards in the spring of 1945 thus became more than an incidental background. It was a signal of transition, a subtle bridge between war and the fragile beginnings of peace. The final weeks of the war in Europe were defined not only by battles and surrenders, but also by quiet, human moments that unfolded behind the front lines. Inside the camps of Western Germany, American soldiers and German women, prisoners, auxiliaries, or displaced civilians, coexisted under the strict boundaries of military regulation. Within this framework, small gestures and sensory experiences gained significance. Among them, music emerged as a subtle yet profound marker of transition. For the soldiers, the act of playing instruments or listening to familiar tunes was more than recreation. It was a preservation of identity, a thread connecting them to home and to the disciplined routines of military life. For those within the wire, it was a rare intrusion of unexpected humanity into an environment dominated by control, silence, and uncertainty. The notes carried across open yards, reaching ears that had long been attuned to commands, footsteps, and the distant echoes of war. In that brief overlap, the boundaries between captor and captive, order and spontaneity, regulation and emotion, were momentarily softened. Such moments reveal the layered complexity of wartime experience. Victory and surrender are often measured in strategy, territory, and statistics, yet human perception of those events is shaped as much by these small, sensory interactions as by the outcomes on the battlefield. The simple strains of music, a trumpet, a snare drum, a phonograph playing a melody, did not decide the war, but they became part of the psychological and emotional landscape that defined its ending. They reminded both soldiers and detainees that, even amid bureaucracy and discipline, ordinary human experience persisted. Ultimately, the image of German women standing silently in the camp yard, hearing music rise across barbed wire, serves as a testament to the nuanced realities of war's conclusion. It underscores the power of sound, culture, and controlled human contact to shape perception, calm tension, and subtly affirm humanity. In the structured aftermath of conflict, these moments became markers of a fragile peace, a reminder that, as the machinery of war slowed, the ordinary rhythms of life began to return. The music faded, yet its echo remained, a symbol of transition, resilience, and the quiet threads of connection that survive even the most turbulent times.